Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here with the Nonfiction on BookTube Tag. This is a tag designed by Olive at A Book Olive, precisely for us during Nonfiction November. So I have been reading nonfiction, although it's nonfiction that I probably would have been reading anyway, just because that's where the rabbit holes of my reading have taken me. If you follow my channel, you know that I have a tendency to latch onto something and to go where it leads me. And at the moment, I've been led into biographies of Louisa May Alcott and journals and published letters. And that seems to be the nonfiction that I'm reading at the moment. So this kind of ties into question one here. How much nonfiction do you read? Now, I don't know for certain. I don't have the patience or the inclination to go through everything I've read in the past couple of years and figure out the exact percentage. But I would guess probably somewhere between a quarter and a third of what I read is likely nonfiction. And that's because, well, in the past, I've read several books when I was doing my master's, which makes sense. But in the almost a year since I've been done my master's, I've continued to read nonfiction because I like books about books. So I read a book on marginalia earlier in the year, and I read a book on libraries last weekend. But by and large, I think the most common type of nonfiction that I read is biographies or autobiographies, or associated with that, collections of letters and journal entries. So it's very much particular authors or people that I'm interested in when I'm reading nonfiction. Not to say that I don't read broader works of nonfiction like history, but my bent is definitely towards the experiences of individuals and individual stories when I'm reading nonfiction. So the second question asks, what kind of nonfiction videos do you make / do you want to make on BookTube? So at this point, when I read nonfiction, it usually just ends up in my Friday reads, the updates I give to you of what I'm reading. Occasionally I do a discussion video or a review of a nonfiction work that I've read, but I find it more difficult to sit down and film a discussion video or film a review of a nonfiction work. One, because there's that intimidation factor. Because you're dealing with real people and real facts, I sort of catch myself when I start to criticize what I'm reading. But also because nonfiction works tend to have a lot more details, and sometimes it's just straight up fact, and sometimes you don't feel as though there's a lot to discuss there, and so sometimes I don't do it for that reason. But I would definitely like to do more individual videos about the nonfiction that I'm reading. I would also like to get into what I did in the past. There's been a few nonfiction works that I did where I did a series of videos. So for instance, 2 or 3 years back now, when I reread Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, I did 3 or 4 videos on that book as I worked my way through it for the second time. And I tried to give summaries, but also a little bit of discussion in terms of what my thoughts were as I read that book. And I've considered, I wanted to do the same with Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, but that book is just, it's difficult for me to get into. I've actually never read that, despite being a little bit obsessed with Simone de Beauvoir. I find her fiction and her memoirs much easier to get into and much easier to understand and absorb than The Second Sex, which is essentially what she's known for. But the short answer here is that I would like to talk about more nonfiction, and I'd like to do it in a more in-depth way. Sometimes I think I struggle with coming up with interesting and intelligent things to say about the books that I'm reading, and so I think that's what stops me quite a bit when I read a nonfiction book. Question 3, what's your favorite subgenre of nonfiction? I pretty much answered that already. I love biography and memoir and letters and diaries, that sort of thing. 4, do you have a favorite nonfiction book? So I have a favorite series of nonfiction books, and that is Simone de Beauvoir's autobiography, her memoirs. Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter is fantastic, but I think my favorite in the series is either Prime of Life or Force of Circumstance. To me, all the books, those first 3 books, kind of all run together as a coherent whole, and so they can almost be considered as one work. So I'll just say her memoirs, whereas when you get into her later memoirs in that series, All Said and Done and Old Age, they're quite different. The tone has shifted, and you can tell that she was at a different place in her life. But moving on. What do you think keeps people from wanting to read more nonfiction? I think there is the perception that nonfiction is difficult. Nonfiction is only for people who are academically minded. Whereas it's not the way at all. A great deal of nonfiction that's published today is very accessible. People automatically reach for novels for entertainment. There's also that perception that nonfiction is not entertaining. You read nonfiction when you want to do work, when you want to challenge yourself, as opposed to fiction, which people often associate with enjoyment. Next question here, why do you like nonfiction? A lot of the nonfiction I read it because I like to sort of imagine what the thought processes of the authors I'm reading are. I like to know more about them, where they're coming from, the influences that shape them, and so that's why I tend to read biography and memoir. But when I reach for other nonfiction books, such as the books I read while doing my political science degree, I reached for those because I was searching for knowledge. I was looking for perspectives on specific subjects. So there's sort of 2 sides to nonfiction for me. There is the exploratory side that I read because I feel it builds on my understanding of an author and of their fiction works. And there is the knowledge-seeking side, I suppose, where I'm looking for information on a specific subject so that I better understand the world. So that's what I'm coming to nonfiction for. What's the best nonfiction book you've read lately? So I'm going to reach over here and I'm going to show you Eden's Outcast by John Madison, which I finished last night. I should probably mention what I'm drinking here. I've got the Burgundy Effect, crafted with black currants. It's a cider from Brickworks Cider House. And this is the first time that I've ever had this. And I have to say that's quite good. That's very good. That was my first sip there. I've just been holding it, as I often end up doing with my drinks when I'm filming. Setting that aside. Eden's Outcast by John Madison. So this is a joint biography of Louisa May Alcott and her father. I read it as part of a read-along that I discovered on, let me just double check these names, Megan Hennett and Kate Howe's channels. They are doing a year of Louisa May Alcott, and they launched things off in November with this joint biography of Louisa and her father. And I quite enjoyed it because it not only tells the story of her life and her writing career, but it also digs into the intellectual influences, which are what I love to discover in a biography. We find out about her interactions with Emerson and her interactions with Thoreau. We find out what she read as a child, her father's educational theories that may have potentially shaped who she became as a woman, and her father's philosophical and writer's circle that definitely shaped her worldview and thus shaped what she wrote about and the themes that appear in her novels. So if you're looking for a biography of Louisa May Alcott, definitely check this one out because it puts her not only within, the context of when she wrote what, but within the context of a larger movement, a larger body of a larger circle of authors, which is something I like. Okay, next question here. What's a nonfiction book you read because of BookTube? This one, I picked it up because of BookTube. I'm trying to think if there's any other nonfiction work that comes to mind that I've specifically read because of BookTube. Well, now that I think about it, I am starting to dig into Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. It's been on my shelf for quite a while. I was going to read it at some point anyway, but Steve Donahue is doing a read-along at the moment of that book. I'm nowhere near where he is at in the book, so I can't really follow along with the videos, but because I saw his videos, that has spurred me to actually pick up the book and dip in a bit. I don't think I'm going to finish it in its entirety, but I definitely am reading a few pages here and there, which, given the nature of the work and how dense it is, I think that's all I can ask at this point. There are much more interesting things I would rather read. Not that I don't want to read that, but it's just not a priority for me at the moment. It's something I feel I should read just because it's so culturally significant, but it's not as gripping as reading the journal entries of Virginia Woolf or a biography of Alcott. I just realized I got question 7 and 8 reversed, but I answered them, so on to question 9. What are some of your nonfiction reading goals? So I would definitely like to actually read more nonfiction, and I'd like to branch out beyond my biography and memoir niche into some more general history books in 2020. Because if you ask me anything about European or American history, I don't really know much. And I know sort of the basics of Canadian history, but it's what I learned at school. It's what I learned from YouTube shorts and whatnot and from documentaries. But I've read very few actual history books on Canadian history. Which is why I have a book on Molecombe and Wolfe that I like to read, because that's been sitting on my shelf for a while, and I picked that up with the intention of getting into some more Canadian history, and then it sat on my shelf for almost a year, perhaps more than a year at this point. But yes, my goal is to read more history in the future. And I'd also like to sort of step up my game with the biographies and the memoirs and the journals, because I only read those now and then, but I would like to incorporate more discussions about those sorts of books on my channel here. So question 10, what's your advice for incorporating more nonfiction into your reading diet? I think you have to change the way you look at what you're reading and select what you're reading. Because as I said, there is that perception that nonfiction is difficult, nonfiction is work, nonfiction is not enjoyable or relaxing. You need to find those nonfiction books that perhaps relate to something you already enjoy reading about and really dig into that. I would recommend doing as I do, just follow the rabbit hole. Find one book you like, and then once you're done reading that, look for other books on the same subject or on perhaps a person that was mentioned in that book, and just go where the journey takes you. That is essentially how I read, and it works out pretty well for me. So I'd recommend that you do the same. Have a great night.